Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville. And Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. My name is Father Nicholas Louh, and I'm joined by my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Louh, who's a clinical psychologist.
Good evening, everyone.
We are so happy that you're joining us tonight on this really very powerful show on this Tuesday, May 31st. If you're new to Live with the Louhs, one thing that you should know is that it's a show that we hope its purpose is to marry both faith and psychology, to give you some practical steps that you can live by each and every day of your life. We broadcast every single Tuesday live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and this is a ministry of St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church right here in Jacksonville, Florida. You can find out more about our church and the great ministries that we do by going to our website at stjohnthedivine.com. Before we dive into tonight's very important topic, we want to encourage you to stay connected to us by joining our social media platforms. Friends, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We're all under the headings of The Louhs. In fact, our show is currently being broadcast live on our Louhs Facebook page. And if you're listening to our show tonight and you want to receive our daily inspirational messages, we have thousands of people that have joined this just to receive a daily word of encouragement. You don't have to be Orthodox or even really be a person of faith, but if you're just looking for some encouragement in your walk of faith, then we encourage you to go to our website at thelouhs.com. Now, our last name is spelled Louhs.com, so it's thelouhs.com. Click on the subscribe button, which is in the far right corner of our homepage, and simply put in your email address. And every day, you're going to receive a daily word of encouragement that Roxanne and I have put together, hopefully with the intention of just simply giving you all a word of encouragement and inspiration. And also, if you're looking for some renewal or a great book to read over this summer vacation, take advantage of our book, Renewing You, A Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan. It's a book that basically takes 8 of the biggest principles that Roxanne and I work with and in every single day, things that people are struggling with, like just how do we take care of ourselves, or how do we deal with difficulties in our life or challenges? We take these from both a faith and psychology perspective to really give you some practical Christianity, as we like to call it. So you can find out about our book by going right here at Ancient Faith. We published our book at going to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com. And if you're just going to be in a long drive during the summer vacation, you can find it at audible.com. Again, it's Renewing You, a Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan. Today we begin the show with a heavy heart. 1 week ago, an 18-year-old young man walked into Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, and began to open fire on elementary school children. He would end up killing 19 children and 2 staff of the school. This became the deadliest school shooting since the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting that took place almost 10 years ago, where 26 students and staff were killed. But this isn't the first time, friends. We've heard about this, sadly, over and over again. This is becoming something that we hear way too often. You all might remember the Columbine High School shooting that took place in 1999. I read an article recently that did some studies of how many school shootings we've had since 1999. It found that there were over 295 shootings since then. In fact, in 2021, there were 42 acts of gun violence at schools in this country. It's the highest since they began counting. In that same article, it found that, listen to this, 185 children, educators, and staff have been killed at school shootings. For many of us, we watched in horror last week as yet another school shooting took place. And for many of us, our hearts are filled with sadness, frustration, anger. You name the emotion, we've all experienced it over the last week. And questions are arising in our hearts right now like, why does this continue to happen? What can we do? How do I talk to my child about this, Father Nick? And so much more. Tonight, friends, we want to dedicate this show to the families who lost their children in Uvalde, Texas. And we want to provide a show tonight that will hopefully be a tool for you to help you not only cope with this tragedy, but how to speak to your children about it. And finally, as Christians, what should we be doing about it? So let's get started. Roxanne, as you know, unfortunately, this is not the first time that we've seen a massacre like this. And for many parents, they're struggling right now. Some of their children are out of school and some are still in school, but they're struggling right now, not only with their own personal fears and anxieties, frustrations, and just unknown uneasiness about their children going to school, but also in how to speak to their children about this. I know that last week you beautifully posted 6 ways to help parents speak to their children about this tragedy of Uvalde. Can you highlight those with our listeners tonight? And we once again want to invite all of you that if you're interested in calling in, we welcome the calls or questions. You can call us right now at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And you can email us also a question at ask@ancientfaith.com, ask@ancientfaith.com. Roxanne, can you highlight with those 6 points that you shared last week with our listeners tonight?
Sure. And again, with such a heavy heart, we're diving into such a big topic. And I want to be very clear that, we are not on this show proclaiming to have all the answers here. We're beginning a conversation that needs to be a conversation. And this is how we learn. This is how we grow as parents, as individuals, and as human beings. We have to learn to talk about things and to put words on things that silently corrupt our souls and weigh heavy in our hearts. And so for our children, number one, I would say is let's not avoid having this conversation. I think it is almost instinctive as a parent to want to protect our children physically. As those parents in Uvalde wanted to do, we want to protect them emotionally from things that can hurt them, from things that can scare them. And we often won't talk about things that we think could create negative emotion in them. And so this is one of those big topics because as parents, we don't feel we have the proper frame to talk about it. We don't know how to talk about it. We're scared, so we're afraid they're going to be scared. And so we do the easy thing and we just try not to bring it up and hope that they aren't talking about it or hearing about it. But as parents, your children have heard about this. It's you don't have to go far without a computer or phone. Listen, there are live feeds that come on children's phones with breaking news if they even have an email system. They have ways of hearing this information without the proper information around it.
And not only that, Roxanne, I mean, even other students that are hearing from their parents about what's going on. So they're hearing it on a multiple levels. And I'd love if you can, in addition to that, maybe speak to a little bit about what I think for so many of us as parents, we don't really realize that our children are learning more from what they see than what we tell them. So just kind of living in our subconscious and how that impacts them.
Absolutely. So in addition to sort of not avoiding this conversation, sort of giving them that safe space for them to talk about it and explore it, it's also recognizing in yourself that it's okay not to be okay. We as parents have to acknowledge our own emotion about what's happened and not try to shelter our children from our tears, from our sadness, from our heavy hearts. I can remember my kids looking up at me all day, the day that this happened, and saying to me, "What's wrong, Mom?
Right.
What's wrong, Mom?" And all I could utter is, "My heart is broken. It is just broken." And that sadness was so real to them because they live in what we feel, not in what we say. So although I may have been talking about a task that needed to be done or something about what we're about to do, they noticed and felt the energy, the vibe that was just coming off of my soul. And so when children live in that, they live in our heavy heart and our sadness. We have to be honest about why. It's very common as parents, when somebody picks up on our emotion, they say, "What's wrong?" And we say, "Nothing, I'm fine." And that's such an invalidating experience for kids because they are picking up on something, but then they question, well, maybe I'm not picking up on the right emotion. Their empathy is real. Their compassion is real. These are God-given gifts that God designed us with. So It's natural. And society has really long stigmatized the expression of negative emotion. When someone cries, our common reaction is we want to make it stop. We say, don't cry, look on the bright side, clear
Mm-hmm.
up, be
Mm-hmm.
strong,
Mm-hmm.
don't let the emotions get the best of you. Well, I'm sure things are going to turn out. We have all these sort of catchphrases, when really someone's crying. Giving commands like this only invokes more stress because we're making a demand of someone who's already in a compromising or demanding moment. We're telling them to cheer up or it's going to be fine. What relieves stress is naming it. It's labeling it. It's putting words on it. And that it's natural. You tell your kids, listen, it is natural to have a broken heart and to be perplexed and to be overwhelmed. And when we watch situations that took place like in Uvalde. And so in that way, you're sort of teaching kids it's okay to feel, and you're putting words on something they may not be able to describe within themselves when they catch wind of what's happening. But it really helps them make sense of what they're noticing, and it teaches them that it is okay
Mm-hmm.
not to feel, be okay,
Mm-hmm.
especially when we witness devastations like these.
I think too, Roxanne, there's some things to be said about just simply being open and honest with our children. Obviously, we want to kind of caution that and within parameters. Maybe you can speak to that because I think for so many people, we sometimes can lose our cool and have an argument with our spouse and not really filter that. But when it comes to stuff like this, we kind of want to shelter them from it, and not kind of share with them what we're kind of going through. But maybe like if you're dealing, at what age would you say is appropriate for them to be having the conversation with their children about what took place in Uvalde?
I mean, I think all ages are okay. We name what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
Graphic detail is not necessary, no matter the age. Teens are gonna hear it because they're gonna read it.
Mm-hmm.
But young kids don't need to hear graphic detail. They may not even necessarily need to know the context in which a shooting happened. But they will hear and they are going to hear that a tragedy has taken place in Texas. And so, words like that for younger kids, um, people have lost their lives
Mm-hmm.
in Texas for very, very young kids. For older kids who are obviously in the know, I usually like to start with asking them what they've heard,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't need to go telling a story until
Mm-hmm.
we know the story they've already been told and what they understand. And so ask them what they know about what happened. Ask them what they understand about what has happened and let that conversation lay the foundation for where you go with it. And I usually open it up to what their questions are. What do you want to know? And if you communicate that level of I'm okay to talk about this, it's basically saying, hey, ask me anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I may not have all the answers, but I'm going to do my best to be open and honest with you about what's happened.
I love that you're really empowering the child to ask those questions as opposed to kind of preparing a script that may or may not be really what they need or what's really going to be helpful, but rather letting them kind of lead how you would respond to that. I think it's so powerful and so important that they themselves let their questions create the conversation.
Well, and interestingly, what we hide from children actually fuels fear. So this
Mm-hmm.
also counterintuitive. The things that we can't talk about, the things that we didn't share with them that they later heard, that makes them more scared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why didn't we talk about that? Why couldn't my mother or my dad talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Why did they hide that from me? There
Mm-hmm.
must be something uh, great to fear. And so, what we can't talk about does breed a birth of curiosity and fear, and it kind of empowers the fear and the threat even more so than what it is. So, it is important to be very honest and open, but avoid the unnecessaries. You don't need the unnecessary detail. I think that's for lawmakers.
Mm-hmm. You're listening to Live with the Lows. We're so grateful that you're joining us on this May 31st, this Tuesday evening. We are speaking about how do we cope as best as we can with the tools that we have to cope with the tragedy that took place at the Uvalde school shooting last week, in which 21 people lost their lives in a tragic massacre. We invite to call us with questions or comments. We invite you to call at 1 855 237 2346. That's 1 855 237 2346. You can also email us during the show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. We also invite you, if you're on social media right now, we are broadcasting our show on the Lowe's Facebook page. That's LOUHS, the Lowe's Facebook page. So if you're not a friend of ours, please go ahead and do so. You can also share your comments in the comment line there. So, Roxanne, I know that you've shared one. I mean, let's just continue to kind of have this conversation with our listeners. What are some other ways that we would tell parents, and how do we speak to our children about the tragedy last week?
I mean, I would say really, really important to know how you feel about what has happened.
Mm,
Um, before you start talking with your children about it. Listen, situations like this can induce rage, hate, pride, volatile division, polarization, and can become a foundation with which we then almost project our own issues and stuff
mm,
onto our kids. This isn't the time um, to allow all of our own negative emotionality to become our child's responsibility. So it's really, really important that you're not going to have all the answers when you open this conversation. I mean, some of it might start to come as you're talking, and you have to almost be mindful of what am I sharing right now, and is this helpful and productive? Is this about my child, or is this about me? And I think it's important to kind of be a little bit self-aware as you're talking about this, but it is important to reflect before you share. How do I feel about this?
mm-hmm,
What are my convictions? What do I feel about gun laws and mental health?
mm-hmm,
Um, where is my heart and my soul right
mm-hmm,
now before I open that conversation? But most importantly, I would say that it is okay to not have all the answers. You're not going to open this conversation in a pretty neat little bow that's tied up in a
mm-hmm,
perfect package, delivered in the perfect frame.
mm-hmm.
You're going to open it up by saying, it is okay. I do not have all the answers to this.
What do you say, Roxanne, to people that have probably been glued to the news over the last week, 24/7? I mean, they're watching the news constantly, and as you were saying that that this, you're not going to have all the answers. Well, in addition to that, I mean, the story has been evolving, and it's in some ways it continues to get even more and more tragic as you watch the news, as you're hearing the stories, as these people are coming to life. They're no longer just numbers. Now you're actually putting faces, and then took one step further, we're looking at souls, God's children. So, what would you say to people that maybe watching the news a lot, and how that could be impacting that conversation with their children?
I would say that if the news is on in your house, it's really important to have a conversation after that news goes off, so that they're not left alone with their own convictions. I mean, if you're hearing families on the news talk about the loss of their child,
Hmm.
and an older adolescent is around, we are supposed to respond to that hurt. We're supposed to bear with those who hurt and allow the conviction in our heart to drive us toward being part of the change that we want to see in this world. We are supposed to allow that intensity rising within us to create a greater conviction. After all, I mean, we are a part of this
Hmm.
plan.
Hmm.
I mean, we are a part of this plan. So to try to artificially turn it off or run from it, or pretend it's not there, or switch the channel, does rob our humanity as being part of that plan.
Is too much news though helpful? I mean, when people are watching the news for hours and hours at a time, I mean, sometimes even at the extent of really spending family time with their children. I mean, what would you say is, when people are watching the news, is there just too much where it can actually have a not only an impact on how people are talking to their children, but really just their own mental health?
I mean, think about back, in the height of grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can even grieve too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a time to let that be uncontained tears,
Right.
and then there's a time to let it cease,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can go out and give your nervous system a break and go out into the world and grocery shop and do
Mm-hmm.
mundane things and have normal conversation, right? And you move in and out of it. And I don't know that I have a perfect answer for how much is too much, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it's something you kind of have to watch. How's everyone doing in
Mm-hmm.
the house? And have we had normal conversation
Mm-hmm.
as well as grieving with those who are mourning, and talking about our convictions and what it rises within us? I
Mm-hmm.
think this is supposed to create the conversation, but should the entire day be that conversation? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to turn it off.
Right. And I think too, it's one of the things that we'll talk about towards the end of the show is, recognizing that uh, that naturally God has given us emotions, and so there should be levels of sadness, of anger, of frustration, of you name it, during this tragedy for us to have. The problem with that, though, is also the fact that some of us can allow that if we're not careful. It can become a spiritual battle. We'll talk about more at the end of the show, but it can become a spiritual battle for us where we don't ever use it as motivation to do something with it, to make a difference in our own life and our own world. And so you'll definitely have to tune in for that as well. But I would just be cautious in how much people are watching the news. Is it creating a motivation, a purpose for you to physically do something about what you're seeing? If not, it can perpetuate a level of sadness and depression because it's forcing us into this darkness, and we're called to expose the darkness because we live in the light of Christ.
And I will say a caveat here in having these conversations and having the news on and talking about the convictions and the emotions. If your child has anxiety, the caveat is a bit different. Though these conversations need to be had, your child has to know who's your safe person at school. Who can they go to talk to if they start feeling nervous at school? What are their coping techniques going to be when they're in the classroom and they start to feel nervous? That's something that if they don't have a counselor and they're worried and they're starting to fear going to school, it may be important to get one. Because if your child has anxiety, this is a whole nother level of fear. Normal children right now who don't have anxiety are scared to go to school, scared to be in public places. And so kids with anxiety, that's a whole nother level. And so you kind of have to watch the response of what's happening within my child as we are talking and giving a voice to that and making sure that we respond to that.
You're listening to Live with the Louhs. We are speaking tonight about the tragedy that took place in Uvalde at the Robb Elementary School, in which 21 people lost their lives in a senseless massacre that took place. We invite you to join the conversation. We're talking about how do we cope with it? How do we navigate through these tragedies that we see? And how do we speak to our children about it? How do we deal with it emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically? So we encourage you to call us 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And we are also broadcasting our show on our Facebook page. So just simply go to the Louhs, Louhs, and you can share your comments in the comment line, please.
So if number one was not to avoid these conversations, and number two, recognizing that it's okay not to be okay, to let them know that your feelings are real, to name them, label them. Number three, assuming they know what happened, so make room for their questions. Number four is being open and honest and willing to answer those questions, not making them seek that curiosity somewhere else. And number five, recognizing that it's okay not to have all those answers. You're not going to be able to wrap it up perfectly, but we are called to give them a framework for how to respond as Christians. Number five would be pray with your children. And I'm not saying that last is least. Pray for the lives, pray with your children for the lives that have been forever changed. Pray for opportunities to act with conviction, to see where God wants you to work to be part of that problem in ways that matter, in ways that make a difference. Pray for our country and for the people in power, in positions of power, the lawmakers, because they can make a difference. And so I do think it's important that in the midst of all of this, that we are also praying with our children.
I love sharing these 6 points, Roxanne, because I think they're so important. And, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side of this break, we're going to actually talk to you about something that I think is so important is what can we do? What are we called to do as Christians? So you want to stay with us right after the break.
Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
New from Ancient Faith Publishing.
Secret Turning, a collection of short stories by Stephen Signori. So I'm out in the lot at Auto Heaven, and up comes Father Nahum from behind. grabs me, gives me a kiss, and tells me he's happy to see me. Wearing his worn-out dungaree bib overalls with the beat-up straw Stetson, pulling his wire basket, going shopping on the avenue. How old is Nahum anyway? Sharky asked. Older than he acts, Lefty said. To be ready said, yeah, and younger than he seems. So he says to me, Theodore, the church is much better when you're there. It's not the whole family when we don't see you. You know, God misses his children, and Nana Olga misses her son.
Now available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook at store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Lows and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Lows? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back to Live with the Lows. We're again grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday evening. We are dedicating this show to the victims who lost their lives at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas last week. 21 people, 21 souls lost their lives in an absolute tragedy. And we spent the first half of our show really spending time on helping parents know how to speak to their children about what took place in Robb Elementary. But we want to spend the second half really talking about what we can do. Before we go any further, I want to once again invite all of you. You can join the conversation by calling us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And you can also, as we mentioned earlier, we are broadcasting our show live on our Lowe's Facebook page, so definitely share any comments or questions you have in the comment line there as well. And as always, we mentioned at the top of the show, we send out these daily inspirational messages every single day that go out at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. If you're looking for a word of encouragement or just a word of inspiration, especially in these times, we just encourage you to go to our website at thelows.com, LOUHS.com. Click on that subscribe button. All you have to do is simply put in your email address, and all we'll do every single day is just give you just a word of encouragement to guide you in your walk of faith. So what are we to do about this? This tragedy that we have seen for so many of us has left us glued to the television. We're oftentimes speaking about this numerous times throughout the day. And what we oftentimes can get to over time is that we can be in this season right now where that's the constant conversation that we're in, that we're in a season where it's impacting us. But oftentimes, just like a 30-minute news cycle, once the season is over, we kind of go back to what we were doing prior. But why not make this different? Because one of the things that so often happens is that we can get so passionate and impactful, but oftentimes we don't follow through with it. We don't really take it. I heard someone put it like this: sometimes we can be so sad about what's going on over there, but we don't realize that God wants us to make a difference here, that God yearns for us. And one of the spiritual battles, friends, that the devil will oftentimes give to us is that he'll oftentimes tell you, it's so sad. Yes, you should mourn. Yes, you can cry. You can be upset about it, but don't do anything about it. And so many of us, time and time again, especially with these school shootings, we can feel so sorry, we can feel so sad, we can just imagine what the parents are going through, but then we just simply shift. We just simply go to a different page in our life. And so, Roxanne, I really want to kind of just have that open conversation with our listeners tonight about really what they can do.
Well, I mean, listen, God gave us the power of the mind, the ability, like no other source of life, to examine our motives, our choices, to think about our thinking, to work together, to reach compromises that allow good to thrive over evil. And most importantly, to examining what's not working to protect our children. And he did give us hearts of compassion to feel with those who are suffering, to bear with them in their pain, and to inspire action, healing, and conviction. He also gave us himself. God came down from heaven voluntarily, walked into the unthinkable suffering through it all to show us his truth, his nonviolent approach to love, to working together into the promise of eternal life. And so I think we can't forget that God, he willingly endured suffering himself. in order to join with us. So he's not distant from our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
He's not distant from our pain. And he gave us hearts to feel all of that with the suffering. It is supposed to inspire us
Mm-hmm.
into action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, I was thinking as we're in the last days of our Paschal celebration in the Orthodox Church, this Easter celebration, that how Christ, after the resurrection, how he went to certain people. He went that you find in the Gospel of John, friends, that he went to Mary Magdalene, who was just weeping because her Savior, our Savior, had died, and she didn't know where they had taken him. And Jesus comes to her and he comforts her. Or how about to Peter, who had denied Christ 3 times? And he comes to Peter and he says, "Hey, Peter, do you love me?" And he kind of gives these litany of questions. And he comes to us and comes to Peter. And through that interaction, Peter's life is transformed. And he becomes one like St. Paul, one of the greatest missionaries of our church. And so the challenge that we have to face is that, yes, we're in this season, a natural season where we should be in a season of mourning and sadness. And that's where we should be. But we also cannot allow that sadness to become a prison that keeps us from actually doing the desire that God wants us to do. Someone asked me the other day, Father Nick, why does God allow this to happen? Where is God in all this? My response oftentimes to them is, we live in a world that is broken, but why God also gives us the free will, if you will. He gives us the opportunity for us to recognize that we are the change that God is depending on. He says, he never said that you're like the salt of the earth. He says, you are the light of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. In other words, I am depending on my people, you, the Christian people, to stand up. And that's why I love this. Blessed are the persecuted, these Beatitudes that we hear in the Gospel of Matthew, where God challenges us to say, listen, it is time for the people to stand up. And I think one of the things, Roxanne, is that we have to be cautious of that. What we don't realize in another spiritual battle that's waging against us is that for so many of us, we allow the news or really or our own political beliefs to have us so dug into this kingdom that we forget that we're not living for this kingdom. How we live in this kingdom, how we promote life, peace, determines of whether or not we inherit the kingdom of heaven. And I think that's one of the things that I think that we have to be very careful is not allow ourselves to be conformed, as the book of Romans says. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, hey, stop thinking about just this world or what the news is telling you or how they kind of get you to kind of think in these different, that if only this happened, then that would take that would solve that problem.
Right, the simple answers.
Right, exactly.
But how often does our culture attempt to define who we are and how should we respond and what we should value? And it's easy to let our identities and our values become disproportionately molded by what the world is telling us right now. And listen, we can't win a war we don't even know we're fighting.
Right.
The Bible says we should not give the devil a foothold in our lives and in our thinking. But we don't even realize that he has a foothold in our polarized thinking, our pride about our way, our simple answer to this is right and you are wrong, in the hate that we have toward others, in the division we play into in our reactions, thinking we have all the answers to this problem. That is the enemy using temptation to target our faith, our character, and God's plan for us to come together to truly work as a society to overcome evil. If he can derail our minds and our hearts, he does win. And the enemy throws us off by these very things. I think we've sometimes forgotten, and this is something that I just breaks my heart as we walk through this tragedy. We have forgotten as a society really how to learn from each other, how to listen to each other and walk alongside each other to discuss the tragedy and the solutions. In ancient times, this is what happened. We sat around, people talked for sometimes hours, philosophers talking about how to solve problems. And, even in marriage conflict, to solve a polarized argument, what do? The negotiation doesn't begin until each side has first felt heard and understood, and the bottom line is established. Here's what you can't take from me, and everything else will be negotiable. This takes a lot of listening. This takes respect for the other side. And so, really, rather than asking what we can learn from our teachers, from the pediatricians, from mental health workers, from differing sides of the lawmakers. We are telling each other our polarized solution, and rather than sort of inviting the conversation that says, let me learn from you. That's going to grow our thinking in sort of divergent ways. But instead, the temptation is to let our pride divide us, conquering our positions over the humility we need to find solution.
Exactly. And it's a tragedy because our hearts are in the right place. I think people genuinely are like, okay, we want to solve this problem. We see we're so physically uncomfortable, saddened, and overwhelmed by what's took place last week. So we naturally, in our own well intentions, are to try to solve the problem. But the challenge that we face is that problem, to be quite honest with you, is not always as easy as someone may be telling us it is. And one of the things I think that we as a society, one of the things that we need to be doing in this is not to further polarize us. Listen to how many times, I'm just going to read you a couple of Bible verses, friends, that just will hopefully inspire you about how important us being as one was to Christ. So this is St. Paul writing in the book of Ephesians, one of my favorite books in the Bible, chapter 4, verses 3-6. Listen to what it says. Make every effort to keep the unity through the bond of peace. I love that. It doesn't say some effort. It says that one of the hallmarks of being a Christian is that you and I make every effort to keep us in unity with one another, that there is one body and spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called to the one Lord, one faith, one baptism. In other words, when you were called by Christ, when you received the inheritance, when Christ barged into the courtroom of your life, friends, and stood in your place and said, you know what, I will die so that they may live. You became one of his. And so he says, because you are now one, we are called to make every effort. But let's not stop there. That's the book of Ephesians. I'll keep going one more time. I love how the prayer that Jesus says in the Garden of Gethsemane, this is the night before he goes to the cross. He's praying, he gets on his hands and knees. Actually, the Bible says that he actually falls on his face and he says this, my prayer is not just for them alone. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message. And listen to this, that they will always be one, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. In other words, one of the ways that people outside of Christianity fall in love with people of faith is that they are one. That's his prayer. It's not my words, these are his words. So then, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be as one. I have given them the glory that you gave me. I have died for them so that they can live, so that they may be one as we are one. I and them and you and me. May they be brought to complete unity, and then let the world know that you sent me and that you have loved me even as you have that you have loved them even as you have loved me. That's from the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 20-24. So what's my point is that we need to be doing everything as a society, not just because of this tragedy, friends, but even prior to that, we are becoming so much more divisive towards one another. And it's clear throughout the scriptures that one of the themes, the mantras that the enemy yearns for us is to divide us and conquer. And you don't need me to answer the question of how successful he's being. You can just simply look at the news in doing that. So let's make that every effort for us to stand in unity. That was Christ's prayer. And I think that all of us need to be working towards that every single day.
I mean, what an important, as Orthodox Christians, this is the response to work toward these things in conversation, to work toward these things if we're writing our senators. And I strongly encourage you all to be really thinking about what is important, what this has ignited within you, to put words on it. But as Orthodox Christians, we are called to not see ourselves as superior to others, but really to come together as more of a unified nation to try to solve. How do you solve good over evil if you're so divided and polarized in everything that you're doing? And one simple answer solves the puzzle.
The thing too, Roxanne, is if one is be open to the conversation, like as Christians, let us lead the way. Let us be open to the conversation. That's number one. And I'll say that another thing that we can all do better at is that we can reset our faith. I love how in the book of Ephesians, again, this is a powerful Bible verse, but it talks about what we need to be. It's the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 10 to 12, 10 to 20. Just keep in mind that Paul is writing to the people of Ephesus. Now, these are what are called the prison epistles. There's 4 books that are called the prison epistles. But he's talking to people who are still worshiping the goddess of Artemis, and who's the goddess of vegetation, goddess of childbirth. And these were these new Christians, and at times they would kind of go back to their old ways. They would allow the division of the world. They would allow things to kind of separate them from following the ways of Christ. One can say that maybe we are struggling with that here in this society. But listen to what he says in chapter 6. He says, "Finally, my friends, build up your strength in union with the Lord by means of his mighty power." So not only are you to build that union with one another, as we talked about in number 1, but also build it up with Christ. And how do you do that? He says, now this, put on the whole armor that God gives you so that you will be able to stand up against the devil's evil tricks. And I would argue that we are in a spiritual battle, friends. These are tricks. For we're not fighting against human beings, but against the wicked spiritual forces, the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers of this dark age. So put on the God's armor now. He puts an exclamation point. That when the evil day comes, that you will be able to resist the enemy's attacks. In other words, when something as tragic as this takes place, that you will not just go back to your default setting and saying, well, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, I'm for guns, I'm anti-guns, but that we would be who Christ is, that we would allow ourselves to be in union with him so much so that we don't allow ourselves to get so boggled down to these specific issues. And don't get me wrong, these are important issues that require, number 1, for us to have that conversation. But it should not overtake us to the point where we lose our faith in what God yearns for us to do. So he says this. He says, so put on the armor, God's armor now, that when the evil day comes, you'll be able to resist it. And after fighting to the end, you will still hold your ground. So stand ready with truth as a belt tied around your waist, with righteousness as your breastplate, and as your shoes, the readiness to announce the good news, listen to this, of peace. At all times, carry faith as a shield. In other words, you're having your faith always with you. For with it, you will be able to put out all the burning arrows shot by the evil one, and accept salvation as a helmet, and the word of God as the sword which the Spirit gives you. Do all this in prayer, asking for God's help, praying on every occasion. So we've kind of shared with you these are just some Bible verses that hopefully will allow us to maybe just reset our faith, that maybe God in this tragedy is saying, okay, look, what took place last week and what's been taking place in our country is unacceptable. But we need to be able to, let's have that conversation. Let's do all that we can to be in unity with one another. That 2, that you are growing closer to God, that I need to lean more into him now, not far away from him. And so I just want to give you a couple ways that you can go about doing that.
I mean, I think in renewing our faith, exactly what you're saying. And, everyone, this is so hard. I think sometimes devastating tragedies like this either push somebody further into their faith or further away. But, one of the, I guess, messages I always sort of simmer in or marinate in moments of devastation is, where I don't see a situation changing, the way I had prayed or the way I had hoped or something doesn't go, is that, God may not always change our situation according to our will, but sometimes he changes us through that situation. And if there is any change that I would imagine, God would want to take place, it is within us as a human race. And to remember that we are called to be working together. We are called to lean back into him. And, I think we have to be careful of all of these temptations that we're struggling with, right? I mean, we hear in the book of James that we do follow temptations, in the form of our own desires, our desire to be right, our desire to keep what's ours, not to compromise, to be prideful, our desire to put what we want ahead of society needs and wants, and sometimes greed and power over what's necessarily good for collective good. And the devil then energizes those desires that are not pure, and he uses them to energize sin. So we have to be careful as a human race, as lawmakers, as people on the news brought on talking about this, that we are not falling into the devil's traps, because those desires are at the root of sin, and we can't be deceived.
Mm-hmm.
And when our temptations are managed well, it affords us, I think, better decision making, and a bit more balance in how we approach these devastating tragedies.
So let us give you just a couple of ways that we can renew our faith. And these are just things that we feel very passionately about. We could speak all day about just one of these topics. But number one is that if we're called, as St. Paul says, to put on this armor of Christ, I want to encourage you all to get grounded in our faith. Get grounded. In other words, if you feel like you're kind of close to God, get closer. And how do we do that? Is we talk about prayer, just taking the time to spend time with God. Pray for the families, as we mentioned earlier. Pray for the victims. I would pray for the soul of the perpetrator. I would pray for all the first responders who had to go into that classroom and can only imagine what they saw and how that's going to traumatize them for the rest of their lives. And pray for the children that did survive and what they're going to be going through. But just spend time in prayer. I would also encourage you in your own walk of faith is to make it a point that every day I'm going to read the Bible. Friends, only 13% of Christians, statistics show, read their Bible on a day-to-day basis. If there's ever a time where we all need to get back to the truth, as we say in our divine liturgy, as well as the scriptures talk about that, it's now that we start reading about Christ and how we are called to navigate through these tragedies, the ups and the downs of life, the seasons of life. So I would encourage you to make it a point that every day I need to get grounded back in my faith. And then I also realize that in every single thing that I'm doing, that whenever I'm praying, that whenever I'm reading the Bible or listening to reading a daily inspirational message or listening to a podcast, that I would always shift to ask yourself this question is, God, what are you trying to tell me? What are you telling me through this Bible verse? Or what do I need to hear you say? Because sometimes prayer is not just about you communicating to God, but you listening to what he's trying to tell you to do. So I would say number one is be grounded in your faith. Number two, friends, is this: be willing to put on the armor of being different. God tells us that we are in this world, but we're not of this world. And that we as Christians are called not simply just to make a difference, but to recognize that we can't make a difference if we're not willing to be different. In the book of Romans, it says this: do not copy the behavior and customs of this world. Let me just ask you, and I include myself in this, am I copying the behaviors of this world? Am I kind of falling into the temptations that I see already happening? Am I allowing myself to be pigeonholed into different sides and that I only see sides and not souls? Because it follows up with this. St. Paul says, but then let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. I love that. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing. In other words, God's saying, stop thinking the way you've been thinking or what someone else is telling you to think, but think about what God thinks. We have this bracelet that I wear right now that it says WWJD. What would Jesus tell us to do? That's what it is. St. Maximus, a great saint of our church, St. Maximus the Confessor, says that being a Christian is an entirely new way of being a human. I love that. When Christ died and rose from the dead, it created a new life, a new birth. So I'm encouraging you, be willing to be different. Even if the people around you are kind of going or on certain sides that you disagree with, it's okay. Be different.
Ask questions.
Ask questions, exactly.
Learn from each other.
Right. Because we're not living for their approval. We're living for God's approval. We're in this world, but we're not of this world. And then number three, I would encourage you, this is all about resetting our faith. As number three, I would encourage you that you would go out and be a witness. The Greek word for the word witness is the word martyr. It was originally used to describe the apostles, but then later it was described to those who just simply witnessed their faith. And can I just encourage all of us that we as Christians, maybe we just need to ask ourselves, would the people that are in my work or at the grocery store or on the road, would they be able to see in my actions my witness of being a Christian? Would they be able to see that? I heard one of the church fathers say one time that we should live in such a way that if the entire Bible was lost, it would be able to be rewritten by the way in which we're living. Isn't that beautiful? That if we just simply lived a certain way, if the Bible had been lost, that if we lived in such a way that people would be able to rewrite it simply by seeing how we're living. You and I are called the lights of this world, the salts of the earth. We're called to be ambassadors of Christ. And so as I just kind of leave you with this last point is that we can't do that if we're allowing ourselves to fall into the temptations of this world. A great Bible verse that you should all write down is 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 12. It says this: don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set the example. Wow, I think we all need to hear that, Roxanne. Set the example for the believers in our speech, in the way in which we live, in love, in faith, and purity.
So, yeah, they'll know we are his disciples by our love. I think we have to remember how to do that in these situations. We love others by giving value to them, working together with them, removing pride, seeking our humility. Remember that Jesus suffered with us. He's not far from us in our trial, and he, by the way, does not bring them. And I do know our trials definitely test our strength, our perseverance, our character, and sometimes even our faith, but they're not from God. God is yearning for us to be part of that solution, though. And we have to remember Hebrews, that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. We have to know that he is working with us to be part of that plan. But if we keep falling into temptation and sin as we do in this broken world, and we are not willing to be different, as you're talking about, as Orthodox Christians, we're not setting ourselves any different. We're falling into the ways of the world, falling into that temptation, and the devil's energizing that sin through our pride. So we have to be careful that we are looking more for how to love, how to give honor, how to respect, how to listen, how to work together, and consider how these devastating tragedies are shaping you. What are you learning about society? What are your convictions? What has God put on your heart? And how can you be a part of that solution, or at least begin these conversations with people who can?
And that brings us to our third point, and that is for us to be the change. To be the change. Roxanne, I'd love for you to speak a little bit, just in our last few minutes of our show, what depression does for us, or sadness. We're seeing so many of us, so many people right now are so struggling with this, that they're just in this kind of quicksand of sadness that in many ways is kind of paralyzing them to be productive. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and just how important it is for us that in these moments that we allow that, as we talked at the top of the show, to be a motivator for us to be the change.
I mean, again, whenever you sit with negative emotion, emotion was given to us on purpose, for a purpose. It is supposed to be functional to get our attention and direct us to what in the world needs our attention, right? So that is the purpose of it. If that emotion is just causing a sort of a marinating in the negativity and a non-productive sense of hopelessness, it's not necessarily working as it should. And so we have to be careful about productive versus unproductive negativity. And it is supposed to motivate us to our convictions. It's supposed to alert us to our deeper values. The compassion that we have as human beings, yeah, that's supposed to get us upset. These are normal, natural reactions to devastation where we're supposed to move forward. And so we have to be careful that depression doesn't rob us of our purpose, and that we just become hopeless, thinking that, we have to do this all on our own. No. God is working with us. We are part of the plan. We're a very tiny part of that plan, but we are part of that plan. And one last caveat I just want to share. I've had a lot of people write into to me about this tragedy, about depression and anxiety and bullying. This is causing these school shootings. And I want to be very clear with every listener that this doesn't happen because somebody was bullied. This doesn't happen just because somebody has depression. People with depression are much more likely to harm themselves than other humans. This is this is something called psychopathic deviance, right? We have these
Hmm.
individuals living in society, and they have a disregard for right and wrong. They're known to be callous and impulsive. And unemotional.
Hmm.
They actually have underactive nervous systems. And so they look for stimulation in whatever ways they can get it. And they don't have empathy.
Hmm.
They do not follow even emotion in a conversation with a nodding head or blinking eyes or an interest or curiosity. They
Interesting.
don't have that. They have a lack of empathy since they're young. And so this is very different than somebody who, an average kid who was just bullied and then they turned around and shot up a school. That's not what is happening. We are underestimating the core of the root of these mental illnesses and how they're operating society amidst all of these other variables. And so it is important for teachers, pediatricians, mental health workers, people in charge of gun laws to be coming together to talk about this, because there are numerous assessments that can pick up on and predict this kind of
Right,
mental
right,
health issue
right. And I
in
think,
children.
and again, I think that so often during these kind of tragedies, and I think we would agree with this, that there obviously is a mental health problem, but I think it's not as easy or as simple as we think of it being someone with depression or anxiety or being bullied. There's a lot of people that have that, and I would go one step further, Roxanne, to share that we have um, the level of mental health that is around the world um, is not less than what we have here. There's mental health issues all over the world.
Such as this diagnosis,
Right.
all over the world.
Exactly. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves as people of faith is, are we doing all that we can to create a society where we are truly loving and caring and showing, and I would argue truly being pro-life, not just pro-birth, but pro-life in everything that we do, and creating a society that does that without jeopardizing people's natural right to bear arms, to have their Second Amendment not violated. That's not what we're sharing right now, but I think it is an opportunity for all of us to realize that we have an opportunity, that remember that we're not fighting for our rights on planet Earth. We're fighting for the right to get into the kingdom of heaven, and it cannot come at the expense or at the cost of other people who are living with us, who are God's children. Literally, they're God's children that are here. And so I think that one of the things that we want to encourage you about, all of you, is be the change. And that change may be a number of ways. It could be speaking with your parish priest about ways that your community can do something for the families. That's one of the things that we're doing here in Jacksonville, to do something for the families of those who lost their lives. It can be through financial support. Obviously, we mentioned earlier about prayer. It could be writing, as we mentioned earlier, perhaps writing to your local congressman or senator, your state senator. But the point being is that what we're encouraging you all to do is to do something, that do not allow yourself to live in the mire of the sadness that we are seeing in this world, but to be productive with it, because the enemy has no problem with you being emotional, being sad, allowing yourself to be crying. He's okay with that. Just don't do anything about it.
Right.
Don't.
Or to be cold to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other temptation, is to yes, be upset for a couple of days and then develop a coldness or numbness to it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's immune to, oh, does another shooting?
Mm-hmm.
That was not just another shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Those were 19 lives that were lost. And so we aren't supposed to be immune
Mm-hmm.
to that at any point in time.
We want to thank you so much for being with us this evening. This was a very difficult show. We wish that we weren't doing a show like this, to be quite honest with you. But we felt like we needed to do a show that would just give all of us an opportunity to take a breath, to look at what we can do. And so we encourage you, if you enjoyed tonight's show, we encourage you, share it with your friends and family. Those 3 points again were: be open to the conversation. Let's learn from each other. Make every effort to stay with one another. That's number one. Make every effort to be in unison with one another. That number two, that we would reset our faith, put on that armor to be a witness, to learn about our faith, to be grounded in it. And then number three is be the change that God is looking for. God is depending on us to make the difference in the world. And so we're encouraging you to do that. We want to thank John Maddox for producing tonight's show and all the great people at Ancient Faith. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us tonight. We also invite you to join our social media platforms. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and on YouTube. All of our sermons are on YouTube, as well as here at Ancient Faith, and you can find them all under the Loughs. Next Tuesday, we'll be speaking with Ann Bezaridis of Holy Cross Seminary, an amazing young woman who's doing great things with our seminarians, and also about about what she talks about and helping out youth that are in need. So we encourage you to join us on that show. That's next Tuesday at 8 p.m. right here on Ancient Faith. Friends, God bless you and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelows.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Loughs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with The Loughs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
New from Ancient Faith Publishing.
Welcoming Gifts, Sacrifice in the Bible and Christian Life by Jeremy